Last summer, I planted potatoes for a fall harvest. And while it wasn't a total bust, I ended up only with enough potatoes to last as seed potatoes the following year. This year, I'm trying again, taking the lessons that I learned from last year, and I'm going to share with you what my plan is going into fall. Because I am still in process learning how to grow potatoes in my Arkansas climate, this is definitely not a roadmap. Instead, I want to share with you the processes that I'm going through in my fall potato plan, including when I'm going to plant, what varieties I'm going to plant, and where I'm going to grow these potatoes, so hopefully I can have more success this year. The biggest question that I had to ask is, when am I going to plant these fall potatoes in my garden? Thankfully, last year I put all the dates in my complete garden planner so I could look back to see what dates I planted my fall potatoes last year. And also, thankfully, I planted 2 different plantings so I could compare 2 different planting times. My first planting last year was on July 11th. What I found is that was a little bit too early. The potatoes do not like growing in the heat. They got long, lanky, leggy, and they just didn't produce much underground. I harvested enough to be able to save a few for seed potatoes the following year, but definitely not enough to eat. I determined then that the July 11th date for my location, where we get really hot in the summer and our average first frost date is not until November 1st, was too early. My second planting, I planted on August 27th. That planting actually did really well. The plants were lush, vibrant, like you would expect potatoes to be. I really had high hopes for that planting because of how amazing those crops looked in the fall. But we ended up having an early freeze last year. As I said, our average first frost date is November 1st. I think the middle of October, we ended up having a pretty severe killing freeze into the 20s. And even though I covered my potatoes with floating row cover, it proved not to be enough. All of the foliage died back. I was able to harvest some potatoes, but again, not enough to really last throughout the winter or provide a whole lot of eating. So I ended up burying them back into the soil and storing them until the spring when I harvested them and then planted them again as seed potatoes. What I learned then is that planting on July 11th in my climate was too early, planting on August 27th was too late. This year, I'm going to be splitting the difference and planting in the early part of August. My hope is that by doing this, I'm going to be able to get the potatoes growing in the cooler part of the fall, and then hopefully get them to where they can be of harvestable size before our first freeze comes. I also have protection measures ready if needed, if we get an early freeze or we're just not ready to harvest. But then I'm also choosing strategically where I'm going to be planting these potatoes, and I'm going to show you that next. The first place I'm going to be planting my potatoes is in these grow bags. One reason that I'm planting in grow bags is that once I plant these seed potatoes, I can put them in the shade to keep them cooler. That way the soil doesn't heat up unnecessarily. And then once they sprout, I can bring them into the sun. It's really important to understand that potatoes need full sun, especially when we're going into fall when the daylight is starting to decrease. But early on, I can keep them as cool as I can until they're ready for the sun. Another benefit of growing these potatoes in grow bags is that if we do have an early freeze or a freeze before I'm ready to harvest, I can move the grow bags into the greenhouse for a little bit of extra protection. I actually did that last year with one test planting, but I planted that potato way too late. It ended up growing pretty far into the fall, but because it hadn't had a chance to get large enough during the fall in the full sun, it didn't produce any harvest. But by planting a little bit earlier and hopefully getting these established and out into the sun and growing in the high points of the fall, I can bring them into the greenhouse if needed to extend the time that they need to grow. The second place I'm going to plant my potatoes is back into my green stalk. If you watched this video, then you can see how my spring potato planting in the green stalk went. I was actually so impressed with that, I decided to devote a couple of tiers to that in the fall. What I'm going to do differently is I'm going to plant the seed potatoes every other pocket on the bottom instead of every pocket, and hopefully I'll be able to compare and maybe get the same amount of harvest. But the same is true when it comes to the winter and early freezes. I can move my green stalk into the greenhouse for a little bit of extra protection if I want, so I have that option with these potatoes as well. The final place I'm going to grow my potatoes is in a raised bed in my garden. These are going to be potatoes that are going to be kind of my extra potatoes, the ones that have already sprouted in my grow room, and let's just see how they do. I can put up hoops and I can put up floating row cover like I did last year. Hopefully by planting a little bit earlier and hoping we don't get an early freeze, they'll be able to produce a great harvest as well. I always get my best harvest when I plant potatoes in raised beds. Hopefully then by planting in the grow bags, in the green stalk, where I can put them into the greenhouse if needed, and also planting in raised beds where I found potatoes grow best, and then have the covers handy, I can get a great potato harvest for the fall. That's the goal. But another key is to choose the varieties that are going to be more likely to perform in the fall, and that's what I'll show you next. For my fall potato crop, I'm going to be planting certified organic, disease-free seed potatoes from Wood Prairie Family Farm. The great news was that they shipped through July this year, and I've never been able to find seed potatoes this time of year. So keep them in mind for next year if you're wanting to plant a fall crop. Another thing I'm going to do is I'm going to replant my potato tubers that I harvested in the spring that have already broken dormancy and they're ready to be planted. So I'm going to grab some of those out of my storage and plant those as well. Now, variety matters when it comes to what potatoes you're going to be planting in your fall garden. If you live in a similar climate to mine where you don't have a lot of mild days before you get a hard freeze, early maturing varieties will mature between 70 and 90 days. What I love about the Wood Prairie catalog is they specifically tell you which varieties are early maturing, mid-season, and late maturing. Some early maturing varieties that are ideal would be Red Cloud, also Caribe, which this is from my harvest from this year, and then also Yukon Gold is an early maturing variety that is a great choice for fall. And then we've also got Dark Red Norland. I'm not going to be growing that for my fall crop most likely, but that's another great early maturing variety. These other two varieties, Caribou Russet and Huckleberry Gold, these are mid-season varieties. They have a days to maturity of about 90 to 120 days. So I know that I'm definitely pushing it this year by growing these two varieties. One reason I'm growing Huckleberry Gold is I grew it for the first time in the spring this year, and they were the best tasting potatoes I'd ever grown. And I love having some gold potatoes for going into the fall and winter for mashed potatoes and boiled potatoes and pot roasts and things like that. These are fantastic. I'll definitely be planting these in my grow bags and or my green stalk so that I can cover them if necessary. And then I'm also trying a Caribou Russet. I really haven't had a whole lot of success growing russets in general in Arkansas just because they tend to be a little bit longer of a growing period, but these being a mid-season, I'm crossing my fingers that I'm just giving it a try. We'll see how it goes. But choosing an early maturing variety is definitely something I would steer you toward if you're looking at growing a fall crop and you are going to be cut short by a hard freeze. The next thing to consider when choosing what varieties you want to plant is going to be dormancy. Each potato crop is going to have different dormancy periods. And basically what that means is that they take a certain amount of time before they start to sprout for the new crop. Now, the reason why long dormancy varieties are good, like Red Cloud, is that once you harvest them, you're going to be able to keep them longer in your pantry and then be able to use them longer. But the drawback to long dormancy varieties like Red Cloud when it comes to planting in the fall is that it's a little bit harder for you to harvest them in the spring and then plant them again in the fall because they may not sprout at the time you need them to sprout. That's why I chose to go ahead and buy the seed potatoes from Wood Prairie, especially with the Red Cloud, because I wanted to make sure these had already been in dormancy throughout the spring. And so they are actually going to be ready to sprout and grow as quickly as possible, which is definitely what we want in the fall. If you're planting from your spring harvest though, having a short dormancy is ideal. As you can see, these Caribes are already sprouting. They have a shorter dormancy. They're obviously not going to keep as long once you harvest them when you get ready to cook them in your kitchen, but for replanting, they're ideal. Again, in the Wood Prairie catalog, their chart shows you which varieties have long dormancy, medium, short, so you can adjust your planting based on what you're wanting, whether that's a short dormancy to get them sprouted early or a longer dormancy to help them to be able to store longer. Again, like last year, everything I'm doing this year is a trial, and I encourage you to try different things in your garden. I will definitely be sharing with you an update on how this goes, especially on Instagram. So if you're on Instagram, I would love to connect with you there at The Beginner's Garden. And if you've had success growing fall potatoes, I would love for you to put your tips in the comments so we can all learn from you. And if you want to see more about what I'm doing in my fall garden to get tips for yours, be sure and subscribe for future videos, and I will see you next week.